Welcome to Success Factors from a Different Angle. My name is Pablo Estuardo. This is week 4, and I have a very interesting topic for today that I think applies to pretty much everyone or anyone who might be watching this video, which has to do with cutover. Now, before I get into the contents, 2 things as always that I wanted to get out of the way. Number 1, anything and everything that I say here today is my own and does not represent the views of my current employer. And number 2, this is very informal, so if you're looking for training or something formal, this is not it. This is just me talking in front of the camera, just like if I was chatting with you at a coffee shop somewhere around the world. All right, cutover. I actually had the opportunity to do a cutover in one of the modules that I managed this week. Thus far, it's been a really good one. We got it done in just a few days, and now we are just monitoring things and then ready to go live on Monday. And so I figured today I wanted to talk about some of the things that I find them very useful once we are cutting over. All right. Now, of course, in the context of success factors, right, cutting over can mean different things depending on the module or what you are actually cutting over, right? I've been involved in cutovers for the entire suite, right? So we're cutting over every single module, and of course that looks like completely different to, let's say, cutting over performance and goals, right? Which you have a fairly predetermined schedule for the utilization of the system, or things that are always running, which is more transactional, like recruiting and onboarding, tend to be different than, let's say, Employee Central, which is more data driven and then transacting events. So anyways, today I'm going to more focus in general terms, right? Of course, every module will have its own intricacies, but I'm very curious, right, to hear from you. Open invitation, please post, or react to what do you think are the most things that you should do and you shouldn't do, right, once we're cutting over. So here are some of the things that I prescribe, right, or have been helpful for me and my projects, which, by the way, all of them have gone live, mostly with no problems. I've had a couple of strugglers, but first of all, plan early, right? And I think cutover is one of those events that, I don't want to say sometimes get neglected, but you don't really think about them until you are there, right? At the beginning of the project, of course, you're focusing on kicking off the project, establishing relationships, so on and so forth. Then you start designing the system. You as a consultant are trying to gather as many requirements as you can. The client is trying to understand the system capabilities and trying to make the best decisions, finding out processes, improving processes, so on and so forth. You start configuring the system, you start playing around with the system. Then you start testing, right? And I have videos in every single phase, right? Because I think they're very interesting. But then, okay, you test it, you go through SIT, you go through UAT, system is running, and then now we gotta go live, right? But up to this point, pretty much everything you've been doing has been on the lower environments. And then typically, timeline-wise, after you test, the time to start cutting over is very minimal, right? Because the idea is that once you're testing, you're solving things right away. So, and of course, if you don't pass the exit criteria, right, as in terms of open items, you can't really, that's a no-go, right? So anyways, and what's interesting about success factors too, granted that things are changing, there's a new tool available to move things over in a more systematic way, but historically, the cutover, for the most part, happens manually, right? You have to reconfigure the entire application or whatever you're implementing again in a productive environment, which of course can be risky, all right? So what I mean about planning early is on 2 fronts, right? Of course, the obvious on the technical front, but what I happen to see often or too often is that, you have accounted for the big stuff, but there are always some tweaks here and there that you cannot do but never make it onto the cutover plan, right? Cutover plans, because you're kind of rushing towards the end of the project, they don't tend to be as comprehensive as I would love them to be. And I think that's fine as long as you have a mechanism to ensure that, everything that you've been doing, even the smaller things, actually make it onto production, right? So from a technical front, the takeaway is that plan and document along the process, throughout the project, everything, and then you can just clean it up before the cutover. You should never, in my opinion, create the cutover plan towards the end. The cutover plan, I think you should get started with it almost at the beginning of the project, right? And just keep it on the side, right, while as you are executing on the different phases. So that's number one, plan early. Also, you want to plan functionally too, right, or with the business, right? What is going to happen? Is there any downtime, right, in terms of using the system, right? Do we need anything from anybody, right? What about the communication? So all that stuff you want to plan early, right? You want to manage the change, right? This is a big deal, so you have to be able to manage that change. And I don't think the communications that are like 2 weeks, a week in advance are too effective, right? You want to massage the population as early as you can. And then there are complexities too, right? Let's say recruiting. How do you deal with your open recs, right? How do you deal with your open applications, right? You're cutting over onboarding. What about the people who are in the middle of the process, right? So these are external population that you might not necessarily have full control over it. Of course, Employee Central and integrations and so on and so forth. And so, start early. All right, so that's number one. Number two, let's see what else I had on my list here. Of course, data, right? Data, for the Employee Central folks, that's a given. Your mocks, your conversions. But then on the other modules, I've seen it too often, right? That you don't really know, you don't have an answer for data. So I just gave the example of recruiting, right? So let's say we're transitioning from one application to the other. What do I do with my open recs? Or even if you are enhancing your already live recruiting module, what do you do with the fields that are perhaps required in which you don't have any data or not, right? Are you asking recruiters to go in and kind of audit the data, or are you doing an import? Or how are you handling that, right? And who do you need help from? So it's almost like play a day off after you're live and start planning early to see what exactly needs to happen, versus just thinking about abstractively, because probably you're going to miss things. I do. I always miss things, in full transparency. And I've been doing this for quite a bit, right? I've done so many cutovers, and I always tend to miss something. So, and I consider myself normal. So if you consider yourself normal, you probably, there's a chance that you might miss things. So in order to avoid that, I suggest to start early. All right, so we talk about plan early, technically speaking, and also functionally speaking. So more change on the change management and communication front, and for training, and then also data. The third item, which again, depending on the module, might change, but I always suggest to not start in the middle of the week, right? I've seen some cutover plans that start like on a Tuesday or on a Wednesday, with the rationale that you might have, a couple of days within the working week, right, to adjust and, kind of get ready. But I'm kind of the opposite. I always suggest to start on a Thursday or on a Friday, in such a way that then if something happens, you have the weekend to troubleshoot and kind of get the system ready. Yes, you got to work over the weekend, but it's better that in the middle and when things are going, because you want to disrupt as little as possible, right, the normal business operations. At least that's my perspective. All right, so plan early, data, don't do it in the middle of the week. Fourth, validate, okay? And there's some differences in opinion with this one, right? I've had it with different clients, I've had it with colleagues, I've had it with other consultants, right? Just because of the nature of how we cut over, technically speaking, in SuccessFactors, I always recommend validating in a production environment. Yes, running test data in production, okay? Now, at first glance, you might say, well, dude, like, are you crazy? You put in test data in production, that sounds really bad. And of course, it depends on the module. But I think just because of the risk of making mistakes or missing things once you're manually moving configuration over, I just think that it's necessary to do it. Of course, you gotta have a plan to purge that data and eventually get the system completely clean. But I just don't trust it, right? I don't trust myself, and I don't trust anyone, right? That everything is just gonna work perfectly. There's always something that tends to get missed. So for example, if you're doing onboarding, recruiting, or some of the talent modules, now with Employee Central, of course, and the concept and the whole idea of integrations, it's a whole different ballgame, right? But at least with the talent modules, launch some forms, create some recs, apply, run some people through onboarding, do what you can, and then of course clean it up ahead of time. And then also take advantage of the proxy functionality, right? At a minimum, if it's a brand new implementation, I always suggest at a minimum proxy as the decision makers, right? So you can see once they log in for the first time what they're gonna see. Is it looking good? Do we need to tweak anything? And then for the high volume, run some transactions, right? I just think it's necessary, right? It doesn't really take too long, and then of course you can clean the system. You'll be good to go. All right. Once again, Planaly data, not just your normal data conversions, but all data. Don't start in the middle of the week. Validate, right? And then in terms of consultants, this is a big deal, I think. If you're a consultant, try to avoid to be on site, right? Because you're gonna get distracted. If you're a client, I recommend don't ask your consultant to be on site because they're gonna get distracted. And I think cutover is such a critical component that you want to be as focused as possible, at least for a day, at least for a couple of days, right? After the fact, be my guest. Spend as much time as you want with your counterpart. But in the middle of cutover, try to minimize distractions. And of course, same with meetings, right? There's no reason to be meeting all day within a cutover. I think a checkpoint in the morning, a checkpoint at the end of the day, just to measure on progress and understand if there's anything big, that's enough. You still can Slack, you can still do Teams, but I don't think it's necessary to abuse meetings, right? Just anything that would avoid focus, right? And try to be as not distracted. All right. And of course, if you're cutting over, technically speaking, that's what you're doing. But then also on the other side, you want to be validating. You want to be making sure that things are running, right? At the end of the day, it's your system, so you should take a little bit ownership on it. And then of course, be ready to react, right? Once you're live, things are going to happen, and I think it's impossible to predict anything and everything. Of course, for the smaller projects, those tend to be very stable, but for the large global organizations, it's always something that is going to happen. So always a ticket that is going to get open. So just be ready to react. And then the last thing that I'll say, give the team a break, right? After a couple of weeks, hypercare, you're stable, you're up and running. At this point in the journey, you finished iteration 3. You went through the process of testing, right? And just managing that is so complex. And then the testing itself, troubleshooting, fixing things, and then of course getting ready for cutover, and then you cut over, and so on and so forth. So give the team a break. So that's what I have for today. If you have any other tips or tricks that you find valuable right at the time of cutting over for this SuccessFactors implementation, I invite you to share them with the community here, and if you get anything out of this video, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, tell all your friends about it. I'll see you next week.